Hello, this is Chuck Stull looking at the telephone industry or telecommunications. This is an industry that is very different than it was a generation ago. New technologies, new leaders, new structure, new policies, and an old name for a new firm. So the AT&T that we'll talk about in this first lecture may not be the AT&T that you are familiar with today. So as often in industries, it's worthwhile to look at the past, to look for lessons for the present and the future. So telecommunications, or the phone industry, is different in some important ways from the previous industries. It is not primarily manufacturing and has a long history of economic regulation. Now, for most of the last century, U.S. phone service was provided by a monopoly, with prices and service controlled by the government. In many other countries, monopoly phone service was operated as a public industry or was publicly owned. So in the US, the only phone company for most of the 20th century was AT&T or Bell Telephone. Bell Telephone had a monopoly in each sector of the industry until 1982. So local telephone service only provided by the Bell system. The long distance calls all through AT&T, through the Bell system. You couldn't buy phone equipment at Target or Walmart. All phone equipment was built and provided by AT&T, both residential and commercial phone equipment, as well as the switching and other network equipment. Now, this telephone monopoly started through patent protection. Alexander Graham Bell won a patent race by just a few hours in 1876. Elisha Gray also filed a patent on a working telephone on the same day, but lost by just coming in a little bit too late. So Alexander Graham Bell, famous as the inventor of the telephone because he won that patent race. Now, once the patent expired, other firms were able to enter. And in major cities, there were competing non-compatible local phone networks by the 1890s. There were something like 6,000 independent phone companies. Now, maintaining a large number of wired networks is quite expensive. And there are network externalities because consumers could only call phones on their own network. There wasn't any interconnection between the separate companies. And so going to the larger system made more value to the customers. And AT&T looked at those network externalities and argued to the federal government that one firm could more efficiently serve the entire market. AT&T made the argument that local phone service was a natural monopoly. It was cheaper for one firm to provide than for two or more firms. And AT&T was successful in its argument. The telephone service was best operated by a single firm as a regulated monopoly, and this was sometimes known as the Kingsbury Commitment in 1913. And initially, it was overseen by the Interstate Commerce Commission. And then in 1934, when the Federal Communications Commission was founded, they became the federal regulator. So AT&T, for most of the 20th century, was a vertically integrated, regulated monopolist. They had several important divisions. Bell Labs was their research division. They had fundamental research underlying much of today's technology sector was developed through this subsidiary. And we'll talk more about that in our next video. Western Electric, originally Elisha Gray's firm, was the manufacturing branch. This company made telephones. So if you look at an old telephone from the 70s or earlier, you will see it was made by Western Electric if it's a U.S. company, and they made all of the network here. The long distance service was called the Long Lines Department, and again, there was at that time only one provider, and that was the Bell System or AT&T. And then there were the local phone companies, so Michigan Bell, New York Telephone, and so forth. And there were 23 of those geographically separate across the countries. Now, there were a few fringe independent companies, mainly serving rural areas, and those did connect to the AT&T network. But for the most part, it was a monopoly in nearly every um, major and minor city. Now, AT&T had its rates or prices and service approved by the Federal Communications Commission and by the state agencies. And again, we talked earlier about imperfect regulation. Now, only local phone service was truly a natural monopoly, and various firms tried to enter, particularly in equipment and later on in long distance. And Bell responded very aggressively. They would have selective price cuts, they would deny connection to the Bell system, and they used regulators to suppress competition. So they were able to prevent for decades meaningful competition in all of their sectors, but in the long run, only local phone service was really a natural monopoly, and so that will lead us to some of the changes that we've seen in this century. This has been Chuck Stull from Kalamazoo College talking about the telephone industry.